Yes.
Yes, started.
Okay. A very good afternoon to all of you. We are about to start our today's program, and I welcome our today's invited speaker, Professor Emeritus Professor Jim Bindon. He's from University of Alabama, United States, and we are celebrating today the World Anthropology Day. And I welcome you all, the participants who are joining different parts of India and also the abroad. And this is very historical moment for us because this invited talk will be organizing in the platform. We are organizing in the platform, joint platform between Darenatum Government College and Mrinali Dotto Mahavidyapit. We signed memorandum of understanding 1 year back, and we regularly organize the different type of lectures, workshops, and exchanging the knowledge of anthropology between us. So today we got uh, one of the eminent anthropologists, Professor Jim Bindon. We know that throughout the world, he's a very famous known anthropologist. And before we listen his exceptional talk, so let me introduce Professor Jim Bindon at first. So Professor Jim Bindon is an emeritus professor of anthropology in the Department of Anthropology, University of Alabama, USA. Professor Bindon studies human biology from the perspectives of human adaptability. He taught at the University of Alabama from 1978. This is the 78 is my birth year. That year I born in this world. So
Yeah.
1978 to 2008. And he also continued his teaching on race even after his retirement until 2015. He has vast research experience, specifically among the Samoa and his biocultural aspect of health and its consequences, including communicable and non-communicable diseases. Professor Bindon was chairman of the Department of Anthropology from University of Alabama from 1993 to 1998. He has also served as executive program committee member of the American Anthropological Association in 1993 to 1994. He was the associate editor of the American Journal of Physical Anthropology 1993 to 1997. Professor Bindon won the University of Alabama National Alumni Association Outstanding Commitment to Teaching Award in 2005. He was named a MacChase Scholars Program Fellow in 2006. For the past 2 decades, Professor Jim has been concerned with the issues having to do with the race. And some of his ideas about the race can be found in blogs Race and Human Variation. Now, today he will be speaking on race is not is equal to biology. So I welcome Professor Jim Bindon to deliver his lecture. Thank you, sir. Please go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you for that delightful introduction. I'm not sure that I deserve all of that, but I'll take it. Thank you very much, Professor Chakravarti and Dr. Tang, for collaborating on this arrangement. I really appreciate their departments and their colleges for making this possible. As Dr. Chakravarti said, most of my career I studied biocultural anthropology looking at Samoans, but I've been thinking and reading much more about race over the last 25 years, and you'll see why as we go through this presentation to a certain extent. But I created a class on race and began to teach it at the University of Alabama just before the millennium, actually. And I taught that well after my retirement, and I eventually turned it over to a biocultural medical anthropologist, Joe Weaver, who has done extensive research work in India. The two of us began collaborating with an historian of science at the University of Alabama, Eric Peterson, in 2017 to start the podcast, Speaking of Race. And so by our own studies and by interviewing other people, we've explored a number of the centuries-long debates over how to measure and define biological and behavioral difference and why it continues to matter. today, I think it's especially appropriate to share some of what I've learned about race because of the deep entanglement of the history of anthropology with the history of ideas about race. So to start with, I just wanted to emphasize the fact that the social sciences in the US tend to teach that race is a social construction. And that's good. But in my experience, there are very few social scientists, even among my biological anthropology colleagues, that actually understand why that's true, why race is not a biological fact in humans. And this is especially true in the face of ever increasing genomic data about human variation. Whoop. Sorry. So, what is race? Ideas about race fall along a continuum from the most extreme biological version, known as essentialism, which argues that race is a natural division of humanity that's biologically meaningful and easily visible to the naked eye. The other extreme of this continuum is constructionism, and that sees race as a socially constructed mechanism of hegemony, power relations. Beliefs along this continuum have a tendency to vary over time, historically, and by academic discipline. And it kind of depends upon what's being taught by whom and to whom in a particular place at a given point in time. Recent American anthropologists fall clearly into the constructivist camp. Several surveys over the last few decades have documented anthropologists are in substantial agreement that race is not biological. The slide that I'm presenting here shows a 2016 poll of about 2,000 anthropologists that were selected out of the American Anthropological Association's Guide to Departments. And this indicates that over 5 out of 6 anthropologists subscribe to social construction. And they also think that most anthropologists do this. Joe Weaver, my colleague, and I were conducting a smaller, less well-designed survey about this issue at about the same time, and we came up with an 89% opposition to biological race among anthropologists. This position is widely accepted in the natural and social sciences as well as the humanities in American academia. But there's a few notable exceptions, primarily in psychology and biology departments. But there's still substantial work to be done, as this 2014 survey of European laypeople and academics shows. In this survey, over 3/4 of the cultural anthropologists in Poland agreed with the statement that there are biological races in humans, along with more than 9 out of 10 English and Polish non-academics. So there's a lot of work to be done to get the idea across that race is not biology. Even in the US, we don't have to go very far back in the history of anthropology to see that there are anthropologists with views more like those that we just saw in Poland. As recently as 1985, in a poll, half of the physical anthropologists surveyed agreed that there are biological races in humans. Almost a third of cultural anthropologists also agreed with that statement. Historically, the cultural anthropologists in the US have been very opposed to race as biology throughout the 20th century. If we look back to the 1960s, you'd see that the essentialist perspective was a majority view in anthropology. Physical anthropology texts were heavily weighted on the side of race as biology, and the faculty teaching physical anthropology in the US was also very lopsided in favor of a biological interpretation of race. Now, the reason for this is a historical accident. It's due to the fact that most physical anthropologists, like me, had been trained by someone who came from Ernest Houghton's Harvard program. My mentor, Paul Baker, was a student of Ernest Houghton. And Houghton took race as biology as a major part of the curriculum that he brought with him from his interactions with Sir Arthur Keith, the eminent British anatomist, excuse me, during Houghton's time as a Rhodes Scholar in England. By contrast, Ashley Montagu, who crossed the ocean in the opposite direction from England to the US, took his PhD at Columbia under Franz Boas, who was responsible for training most of the cultural anthropologists. And Boas and Ruth Benedict were Montagu's advisors. And Montagu was writing and speaking against racist biology even before he joined the Columbia program in the early 1930s. Ashley Montagu, coming out of that anti-biology as race background, was instrumental in advocating for a constructivist interpretation of race in the first two statements that were published on race by UNESCO after World War II in 1950 and 1951. To get an understanding of why anthropologists have such a history of being committed to this biological view of race, we need to understand a little bit about the history of the concept, and I think you'll see how it co-developed with anthropology. Using race to describe a natural set of human categories, we see first really beginning in the 16th century. The term became inscribed on differences that were being seen and written into legal documents in early Mexico between Spanish, indigenous, and African peoples. Then by the early 17th century, race was being used in Spain to negatively refer to people of Moorish or Jewish ancestry. In a prequel to the Enlightenment, the term race was used by François Bernier in a Parisian literary salon in an almost modern sense to describe the four human groups based on geography and physical characteristics. This article was published in 1684 in the oldest academic journal in Europe. Ideas about race were refined during the 18th century by Enlightenment figures like Linnaeus, who, in creating our modern system of taxonomy, divided humans into four color-coded geographic races as early as 1735. Later, the philosopher Immanuel Kant, in the first academic coursework in anthropology, used his lecture series of the different human races to really forever weld race into anthropology. And he had a hierarchical view of race with, of course, Europeans at the top and Africans on the bottom, something that we see over and over again throughout the history of anthropology. The 19th century American School of Anthropology saw the most extreme development of this racist biology viewpoint in a concept known as polygyny. That argues for races being the result of different creations and therefore really being different species of humans. This was thrown up as a last-ditch defense of racial slavery and viciously defended by a number of people who we think of as early biological anthropologists in the US. Polygyny reached its peak with the 1854 publication of Types of Mankind. And that became the official guide to race in the US and really throughout much of the rest of the world for the remainder of the 19th century. Josiah Nott was an Alabama personality. And as a personal aside, I just want to point out that here at the University of Alabama, we finally managed to get his name taken off of the building that houses our honors college only in the fall of 2020. So that's a very recent development in our local history. The idea, I'm sorry, what? Okay.
Sir, continue, sir, continue.
Continue,
Okay.
go ahead.
Okay. The idea that race may not be a natural biological set of categories really doesn't get any scientific weight, anything happening in the literature until we get up to the 1890s. And at that point in time, Franz Boas, the father of most of our cultural anthropologists in the US, and W.E.B. Du Bois, the sociologist, both argued for the separation of race from behavioral and cultural patterns. Boas's human faculty as determined by race and Du Bois's the conservation of races were the beginnings of the social construction of race, the whole idea that we could move in a constructivist direction. The conflict between the essentialist and the constructivist concepts of race in American anthropology was carried out between Boas's mostly cultural anthropology students from Columbia and Houghton's physical anthropology students from Harvard throughout most of the 20th century. So what is social construction of race? We use that term, we say race is a social construction, we rarely step back and really define what we're meaning by that. By calling race a social construction, we're saying that race is not a set of natural biological categories that reflects human genetic variation. We're saying that there's no physical or genetic characteristics that unambiguously fit within our notions of racial boundaries. Instead, we're saying that race has been invented as an historical product of particular times and political situations and places in human history. Racial classification has been an instrument of power meant to establish or maintain a social hierarchy, elevating some people economically, socially, and politically at the expense of others. My friend John Marks, another biological anthropologist some of you may know, has my favorite description of what we mean by constructed race. Race, he tells his students, is the intersection of difference and meaning. What that means is that race can't be discovered by examining human differences because we're all different from one another in some way. Race instead is constructed by people in power deciding that certain differences are more important than others. For example, deciding that somehow the difference between a Norwegian and a Saudi Arabian is not as significant a difference as that between a Saudi Arabian and a Sudanese individual. Race is an act of naming difference. It's a cultural decision that some differences are worth acknowledging and others should be just ignored. So we don't really discover race by measuring or observing people. Rather, we construct race in our minds and we impose it on people. Now, I'm happy that most anthropologists, at least in the US, have embraced a constructivist approach to race, but I'm not sure that most of them could tell you why race is this kind of social construction and not a biological fact. So I want to work on that issue and try and make some arguments about why race does not work as a biological phenomenon in humans. There's only one valid biological use of the term race as a subdivision of a species, or in other words, a taxonomic subspecies. Race can show its biological basis as a subspecies as a series of evolutionary lineages. This is the way that Darwin used the term race in the subtitle of On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Those human lineages are shown in this 1946 evolutionary tree of man by Ernest Houghton from his book Up from the Ape. He derives different races from different fossil forms that were known at that time, and he derives the basic white race from the infamous Piltdown frog fossil that forms the base of that branch. The other way that you can see race is as genetically isolated geographic groups, as shown in this figure from Lothrop Stoddard's 1920 white supremacist screed, The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy. You can guess what he's talking about there. There are techniques, especially in the modern genomic age, to statistically test for the presence of either the tree form or the genetic population form of patterning in our genetic background. For races to be legitimate evolutionary lineages requires a sharp genetic differentiation between the races, and the boundaries have to reflect historical evolutionary splits. Like this tree based on the genomic analysis of contemporary populations. You can see the nice straight lines that branch as they get closer to the present at the bottom of the chart. The horizontal arrows show modeled admixture or interbreeding or migration events as if they were simple and discrete happenings. If this was the true nature of our genetic history, we might actually have biological genetic races in humans. But instead, admixture events have been much less discrete and patterned like this throughout time, because we're dealing with extremely mobile groups of foragers throughout space and time. They're demographically complex, they're culturally complicated, and they're genetically already connected to one another. So what we see is a pattern, a biological and genetic pattern that just simply becomes more and more complicated, especially over the last 10,000 years or so, as agriculture comes in and population growth and movements and interactions occurring as a result of the spread of agriculture. This phenomenon is only accelerated over the last several thousands of years, resulting in genetic relationships that don't so much resemble the branches of a tree as, as a bowl of ramen noodles, another metaphor that I have to thank John Marks for. Statistical testing of contemporary genetic variation rejects a tree-like structure. We don't have those neat branches. So what that indicates is that we don't have biologically valid evolutionary lineages showing up in our genetic patterning. So how about the other kind of definition, the biological valid definition of race? Do we have genetically isolated geographic races? And how would we know whether we do or not? Well, this is kind of funny. Back in the Stone Age, when I took my first class about race, I was taught the 75% rule of thumb used by field biologists. That says that if you can separate one group from another with 75% accuracy based on physical characteristics, that's good enough to call them different races. As biology has moved more and more and more towards genetics for taxonomic purposes, races have come to be defined by the 25% rule of thumb. That is, if the variable genes of two groups differ by at least 25%, then we say we're looking at two different races. This is measured by a population genetic parameter called the co-ancestry coefficient. And please, you don't have to know how these are defined or anything like that. Just hang in there and I'll show you how it's used. This is the co-ancestry coefficient, FST, and that takes values between 0 and 1. The higher the value, the more different the genetics are between the two populations. The 25% boundary is represented by a value of FST that is at least 0.25. It turns out that the average value for worldwide human groups is much lower than that. It averages about 5% or 0.05, well below what we would consider different races. But that's still a significant amount of genetic variation between groups. So we need to know how that's patterned. Well, human populations differ by distance, as you might expect. The farther apart two human populations are, based on prehistoric migration patterns from our African homelands, the greater the genetic differences between those populations. This is a graph charting the co-ancestry coefficient, that FST value, for all two-way pairs of 53 global populations that were done in this particular study against geographic distance. Distance here is shown as all humans starting in Africa and then migrating out across the globe. So the most distant population pairs on this chart would consist of African and South American groups as they had migrated all the way across Eurasia and down through the land bridge into South America. There's a strong relationship between the amount of difference as shown by that FST statistic and the distance between two populations. There's no obvious breaks that would suggest races, and there's no values above the 0.25 threshold. Even populations from Africa and South America that are showing more than 17,000 miles of distance in this measurement. So I've got a story about this 25% rule, but does this rule actually work? Does it have any utility or validity? And there's a really convenient example that we can look at. That is our closest living relatives, the chimpanzees. Let's take a look at them and see how that works out using this measurement of co-ancestry. Chimpanzees, the genus Pan, are traditionally recognized to have two different species. Pan paniscus, the bonobo or pygmy chimps, and they're shown in this chart by the purple region in Central Africa, just below what's the bend in the Congo River there. And then Pan troglodytes, the common chimp, which is frequently split into 5 regional subspecies. From the west, we have Verus, that's represented by the red, and then Elioti, the light blue in the Gulf of Guinea. Troglodytes is the orange along the west coast in Central Africa. And then there's 2 eastern races that overlap, Schweinfurthii and Maringuensis. When we look at the degree of genetic similarity and difference using a co-ancestry statistic for 6 groups of chimpanzees, the 5 supposed putative races and the bonobos, we can see how this measure works for chimps. There are very high levels of genetic difference between the 2 species, as we would expect. Bonobos differ from all 5 groups of common chimpanzees by over 2/3 of their shared genetic variability. Those are substantial high rates of genetic difference. The chimps from Upper Guinea, the Verus subspecies, are all quite different from the other common chimp groups, and the Gulf of Guinea chimps, the Elioti subspecies, are also significantly different from the Central and Eastern African groups. But the 3 putative races from Central and Eastern Africa have very low levels of genetic difference. They appear to have separated less than 100,000 years ago. Those 3 groups have stayed together and maintained interbreeding, and it suggests that all 3 of those groups should be considered members of a single race. So instead of having 5 races, common chimps should be thought of as having 3 races. Now, this use of this FST, this co-ancestry coefficient, this gives us a way to measure how genetically different 2 populations are. There's another way to understand how important genetic differences between more than 2 groups are, and that's to use a form of an analysis of variance statistical technique that allows us to see how much genetic variation is due to differences between individuals within local populations, how much is due to differences between local populations within a race, and how much then is due to differences between our races. When we use this type of technique and look at the partitioning of genetic variation in common chimpanzees, we see that about 2/3 of the species genetic variation is simply between individuals within local populations. So most of the variation is just individual variation locally. About another 5% of the gene differences is due to differences between local populations within those 3 race groups. And finally, differences between the 3 racial groups we highlighted accounts for about 30% of the genetic variation in the species of common chimpanzees. This is what we would expect to see in a species with significant separation and true biological genetic races. So how does this analysis work for human genetic variation? Well, for humans, over 90% of the genetic variation exists simply between individuals within local populations. Less than 5% of the species genetic variation comes from differences between local populations or between races. This is the pattern we would expect to find in a species with relatively recent times of groups splitting off and no true genetic or biological races. Now, it may be hard to see what I'm showing you with these 2 pie charts or the importance of this, but if you take a second and look at it, no matter how much overall genetic variation there is in a species, if a large part of that variation comes from differences between racial groups, then that would validate biological races. But if the differences between the races doesn't account for very much of the genetic variation, then races are genetically insignificant, and we shouldn't use them as representations of the biological or genetic structure of the species. Now, this type of diversity apportionment analysis has been criticized, but much more recent work with larger samples and evolutionary assumptions more closely resembling our species history have come to exactly the same conclusion, that our genetic variation is simply not patterned along the lines of what we think we see as race. Now, you might wonder when we figured all this out. Well, the scary thing is that we got this basic conclusion in 1972. At that point in time, I was taking a class on human variation and race at UC Berkeley from Vince Serich. And he was teaching me about another Houghton student, Carlton Kuhn's 1962 book, The Origin of Races. In that, Kuhn suggests that our races go all the way back to Homo erectus, kind of like that diagram that you saw from Houghton on the earlier slide. And he was arguing that we were really different evolutionary lineages with very deep time splits between us. Meanwhile, the same time I was taking that class, the evolutionary biologist, evolutionary geneticist Richard Lewontin had been gathering together a bunch of human genetic data, all that he could find at the time. This was mostly a bunch of blood group data and a few other isolated proteins. And he used that to calculate that race accounted for about 6% of human genetic variation based on that crude measurement. Needless to say, my professor never shared that information with my class. Instead, we were continued to be taught about the biological basis of race. So we've had the genetic basics to prove that race was a social, not a genetic construct back in 1972, 50 years ago this year. The debate should have been over then, or at least the whole discipline of anthropology and biology and all the social scientists should have taken a serious turn towards emphasizing constructionism. As more and more genetic data from populations all over the world accumulated, including finally DNA sequence data, it seemed like the essentialist concept of race would simply wither.
Sir, you are mute. Still mute, sir. Not audible.
How about now?
Yeah, it's fine, sir.
Sorry about that. Okay, am I on? Can you hear me still?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Finally, in June 2000, the first full draft of the Human Genome Project got announced. And there was great hope among many people, especially among social scientists, that sequencing the human genome would finally do away with biological ideas about race. Listening to President Clinton at the ceremony announcing that first draft, saying all human beings, regardless of race, are more than 99% the same, it sounded like that battle was going to be over, that it was won by the constructionist side. Unfortunately, the argument that he made has no real meaning for race, since, as we talked about earlier with the pie charts, it's not about how much variation exists in the species. It's the patterning of that variation that's important for whether or not you have biological races. It was only 2.5 years later that the biological basis of race came roaring back. It was joined by scientists and journalists coming from the essentialist perspective, and they began calling themselves racial realists at this point. And they cited the findings of a team of researchers who had analyzed DNA sequence information in 52 populations. This made newspaper headlines all over, and in the US, Nicholas Wade, a science writer for the New York Times, was especially vociferous about this topic. The genetic structure of human populations, the first DNA sequence study of global patterns of human genetic variability, was published by a team led by Noah Rosenberg. He's a computational biologist at Stanford. That article became the most widely cited piece from the journal Science in 2002. I've highlighted some information from the abstract of the article here, and as the article says, race, they're referring to it as major groups, trying to step away from the term race. accounted for 3 to 5% of the genetic variation they found. But the essentialists didn't pay any attention to that. They focused on the next sentence that says we identified 6 main genetic clusters, and 5 of those correspond to major geographic regions. On a side note, it's no coincidence that they focused on 5 races, since the number of races used by the US Census had been changed by a revision to the document that defines races for the US government from 4 to 5 only in 1997. If this analysis had been done 6 years earlier, the essentialists would have ignored the 5 and 6 cluster solutions and focused on the 4 to match with the US Census categories. Now, it's natural that you should be confused by this, and I don't blame you for that. Some of the confusion around the biological race versus social race conclusion is simply based on the use of 2 different families of statistical techniques, and which should we pay more attention to. The essentialists in favor of biological race seized on the cluster analysis because they thought they could see biological differences in that would map onto our socially defined races. By contrast, constructivists like me focused on the diversity partitioning analysis that said that 3 to 5% of the genetic variability was due to these major groups. In the paper, the researchers reported on sorting the genomes into 2 to 6 clusters, and these clusters are depicted here, and they used a statistical technique that's called structure. This is a routine that tries to group individuals together based on the similarity of their genetic sequence information. In spite of the abstract emphasizing the higher likelihood 6 cluster solution, essentialists focused on and almost exclusively published about the 5 cluster solution, which they said mimicked the 5 US Census races. But that's not really true when you look at who was included where. Reading from the left to the right on this K=5 cluster solution, you have brown as sub-Saharan Africans, blue including Europeans, North Africans, Near and Middle Easterners, and Central and Southern Asians, pink as East Asians, and green as Pacific Islanders. The purple are, in their terms, Amerindians. That's their 5 groups. Those are not really consonant with even what was defined as 5 races in the US Census for 2000. In the 6th cluster solution, the add-in is that little yellow band a little to the right of center of that band, and that comes from the Kalash group in Pakistan that claims Greek heritage. That creates the 6th group in the cluster, in the 6th cluster solution. In the paper, the abstract also emphasized diversity partitioning. It said that races were very insignificant, and I used values from their articles in the pie chart that I showed you earlier, breaking out the genetic variation between individuals, populations, and races. I also used those numbers in class starting in the spring of 2003 to illustrate to my race class the genetic insignificance of race in humans. The supplementary material accompanying that article also presented the FST calculation for their major groups, and that calculated an average of about 0.05 or 5% genetic differences between the racial groups. So how do we go about deciding whether we should pay more attention to clustering or to diversity partitioning? And I think there are several reasons to emphasize diversity partitioning. The number of clusters in a routine-like structure is a predetermined number determined by the researchers. They have to input the number of clusters that they want the sample divided into. Rosenberg and colleagues could have come up with as many as 1,055 clusters based on the 1,056 individuals that they had in their sample. The clusters are actually affected by the order in which the data is processed. So what you take out affects what's left and how the rest of the data is grouped together. To overcome this limitation, the researchers do 10 runs at each pre-specified number of clusters. And they did that starting with 2 clusters, as you saw on the slide, but going all the way up to 20, not just up to 6, as they reported in the article. Each time it does that, the data has to be reordered so that you're getting a relatively random sampling of the individuals and seeing how they're clustered together. Now, the researchers can tell you which analysis is statistically best. And it turns out that one of the 10 runs that they did with 16 clusters was the overall most likely solution. But there are no valid criteria that they can use to tie a certain number of clusters to biologically valid races in humans. By contrast, the diversity partitioning analysis, the pie chart that I gave you earlier, that shows you how significant the genetic patterning of race is, particularly if you compare our pie chart with the chimp pie chart. You can see that in a species, a very closely related species, you can have racial differences, genetic differences, whereas in humans, you don't. So that's the important part. Human variation is patterned by distance, and the genetic differences between our socially constructed racial groups are remarkably low. One thing that I've used over the years to help my students see how our genetic variation is distributed is this type of a Venn diagram that shows that almost all the genes are shared across our species. Differences are a result of our history in different local areas and migrations. Since we have spent most of our existence in Africa, that's where most of our genetic variation is built up. Since the other regions have been populated by African migrants relatively recently, for the most part, less than the last 60,000 years or so, their genes are almost entirely encompassed by genetic variation in Africa. In order to determine ancestry, DNA companies focus on that tiny fraction of a percent of DNA that differs between groups. Even then, you can't just assume that people of the same socially constructed racial group will be more similar to one another than they are to someone from another racial group. These 3 men were involved in creating the first draft of the human genome, and they were among the first individuals to have their entire 3 billion nucleotide genome sequenced. As President Clinton said, our DNA varies by around 0.1% on average between any 2 people. That would amount to a little over 3 million nucleotides out of our entire genome. This Venn diagram shows the overlapping and unique portions of the variable locations in the DNA for those 3 genomicists on the previous slide. When their genomes were compared, the 2 European guys shared less DNA with each other, as shown by the arrow here, than either did with the Asian scientist. And yes, it is that James Watson who won a Nobel Prize for co-discovering the structure of DNA, but now is more infamous for his outrageous racist claims. Okay, that's my argument for the lack of biological validity, but that's not stopping racial realists or essentialists from trying to continue their arguments for biological races. I'm going to caution you about 2 particular categories of arguments that they use, and I've seen these in action very recently. The first of these arguments harks back to the 75% rule of thumb for defining races on the basis of physical appearance. The second of these 2 is the use of the term population very loosely in place of race. In my class with Vince Sarich at Berkeley in 1972, he projected slides up on the screen of a street market scene from Nairobi, and then another slide with a group of white-jacketed scientists at a conference in Oslo. The contrast in skin color and many other less biologically driven characteristics was obvious to us and to him. And what he was doing was trying to get us to think categorically about the nature of human variation, to think that skin color gave us some real underlying fundamental genetic understanding of differences between these 2 groups. Most of you are probably familiar with some variety of the skin color map on the right of this chart. It shows up in anthropology texts all over the place from the 1940s on. A quick glance will show you the difference between East African and Scandinavian skin tones as represented on this map. In contrast to that map, that's an amalgamation of skin color estimates for a couple of score of populations visited by ethnographers well before World War II, and with very imperfect tools for measuring skin color. This chart shows a fairly continuous distribution of carefully measured skin colors, with the darkest on the bottom left of the chart and the lightest on the top right, with no obvious 75% rule breaks to categorize people into racial groups. Perhaps what's most important, what we've learned, is that African populations are substantially more variable in both skin color and the genetic variants underpinning skin color than are populations outside of Africa. Now, if somehow one of these essentialists can get you to buy into the argument that skin color is a good indicator of different races in humans, then they're very likely to start talking to you next about dog breeds. Now, that may sound like a non sequitur, but the thing is, if they can get you to buy into dog breeds as an analogy for races in humans, they've basically got you swallowing their entire argument. My former professor, Vince Sarich, used that analogy about dog breeds in his 2005 book, Arguing for the Biological Reality of Race and Its Effect on Human Behavior. There are a couple of problems with that. First, dog breeds have much less genetic variation within their breeds and much more variation between their breeds than human races do. And secondly, technical specifications written for dog breeds usually include behavioral characteristics. So if they can get you to link dog breeds to races, and you would automatically acknowledge that there are behavioral differences between different breeds of dogs, like aggression or retrieving or spotting prey, or some dogs are better with children than others, then it's a short step to get you to link skin color to differences in intelligence between race groups. And that's where these people are trying to go with their arguments. The second argument that comes up is the idea that race is just a population. The evolutionary biologist Theodosius Dobzhansky played a very important role in developing the synthetic theory of evolution. He also argued strongly against race as an explanation for behavioral differences, but he supported the idea of biological races in humans. Basically, he said that you could divide us up into groups any way that you want to, so that you could always find a genetic difference between two groups, no matter how you define them. I've seen the example that if you're a fan of baseball, you could study the genomic differences between Boston Red Sox and New York Yankee fans, and you'd have genes that differ between those groups. Racial realists like my former professor, Vince Sarich, define races as populations so they can emphasize any group differences they want to. For example, East African distance runners versus West African sprinters, or Ashkenazi Jews versus Europeans, which becomes very popular in that crowd. The problem is that population has a very specific meaning for genetics, and the lay understanding is very far from the biological understanding of what a population is. In genetics, a population has to be a breeding or mating group so that we can think of it as having a shared gene pool, and we can talk about the genes of the population. A population also has an effective population size. That's the number of individuals who contribute genes to the next generation. DNA estimates of effective population size in humans range from around 2,000 to 10,000 individuals. That was exciting. And best estimates fall between about 3,000 to 7,500 individuals in a given for an effective population size. And while we'd like to think that we're members of some great global population of millions or billions, the mating pool that each individual belongs to is much smaller than that. And nobody would suggest that we're, have somewhere between 1 to 2.5 million populations or races of humans on the planet. But then people like Sarich try to get around that by saying that races are groups of populations. But we're back to the same problem that I pointed out before in the cluster and diversity partitioning argument. We don't have any genetic reason to group specific populations into specific races. But the essentialists are not going to go away anytime soon. I've seen this over and over and over again in my 50 years as an anthropology student and then professor. And I'm really chagrined by how naive I've been at times, expecting that racial thought and racist biology would just simply fade away and I could stop thinking or teaching or talking about it. My first encounter with scientific racism was when I was an undergrad at Berkeley, and I walked through clouds of tear gas and buckshot aimed at the People's Park demonstrations in May of 1969. Part of the crowd that I was involved in was protesting a tenured professor in the College of Education. 2 months earlier, Arthur Jensen had published How Much Can We Boost IQ and Scholastic Achievement? It was reigniting the, quote, scientific debate about race and intelligence. Jensen was pushing a very heavy genetic view of IQ in 1969 to account for test score and life success differences between blacks and whites in the U.S. He made the argument that government shouldn't put money into programs for disadvantaged minorities because their inferior genetics would make it a waste of money. And he said minority kids shouldn't have high aspirations anyway because they needed to be able to be happy with their genetically determined inferior social position. I should have known what was going on then, but I didn't. Still, by the time I started teaching anthropology classes, I did little more than a single class day out of a semester on race and intelligence. In that, I just pointed out the logical fallacy of Jensen's work. He was relying heavily on twin studies to estimate heritability. Heritability is a single population-specific measurement, and then he was trying to use that heritability to make a case about differences in test scores between populations. That's a very easy argument to tear apart because it is logically flawed. Because it seemed to me that racialism and biology, racist biology was dying out, I almost cut that lecture out of some of my anthropology classes by the late 1980s. I went to an administrator's office at the University of Alabama and looked up and saw a bookshelf of hereditarian and racist books like these on the slide on intelligence. I figured at that point that I'd better start doing a better job talking about race in my classes. So I pulled out my copy of Stephen Jay Gould's Mismeasure of Man and added in some additional context on race and the history of the concept and intelligence. And then in 1994, the bell curve came out, and that just reiterated all of the things that Jensen had said in 1969. And I knew that I had to pull out all the punches and start combating scientific racism with my career. That's when I decided to learn more myself and create my class on race. The racial realists haven't gone anywhere. Former New York Times science writer Nicholas Wade's 2014 book, A Troublesome Inheritance, used that cluster analysis from the 2002 article we discussed earlier to bolster his notion of 5 biological races with different cultural and behavioral attributes. This egregious misuse of that cluster analysis actually caused 5 of the original paper's authors to publish a letter in the New York Times responding to Wade's book. That's especially poignant because that was Wade's former publication. In it, they castigated his interpretation of their work. In 2018, the hereditarian psychologist Robert Plomin published his book, Blueprint: How DNA Makes Us Who We Are, along with a Scientific American blog post titled, In the Nature-Nurture War, Nature Wins. He's not being subtle at all. In these, he's continuing to sell a genetic cause of behavioral differences that can then be mapped onto whatever our cultural idea of race is. Plomin even worked on the Chinese project to try to identify DNA sequences associated with high IQ to further a late 20th, early 21st century eugenic notion of trying to breed a more intelligent population. Just a couple of years ago, I got called on to rebut a speaker, Bo Weingart, a hereditarian psychologist who had come to the University of Alabama campus pushing a racist agenda. In his presentation, he was very timid. He shied away from using the word race, but in his publications, he was explicit in stating that the lower intelligence of blacks in America is due to genetics. The lesson here is to stay vigilant. Again, I've tried to get away from talking about race, and all I find is that you have to do it. And as anthropologists, we own this concept. We have to pay attention to race. We have to be prepared to rebut the people that are trying to use biological race as a way to take us apart. Now, there's a couple of potential confusions here. By saying that race isn't biological, I'm not trying to say that we're all biologically the same, okay? We know we're all different from one another. It's just that those differences aren't meaningfully patterned along the lines of our socially constructed races. We need to remember that even though we can demonstrate that race isn't genetically based, biologically valid category in humans, our social categories of race do have significant health and well-being implications. One of my favorite reads on race was Dorothy Roberts' Fatal Invention. She does an excellent job of making the case that in spite of the fact that race is not a valid biological category, it can still kill people. As she notes, once we realize that racial health disparities we see in the US are not the result of genetic differences between racial groups, but rather they're the result of social inequality, the sooner that we can get to work on correcting the social situations, systemic racism being the root cause, that created and maintained this disparity. We've gotten a good reminder about the importance of socially constructed race for health recently, as people of color in the US experienced a massive disparity in health outcomes during the pandemic. And in spite of attempts to blame this on biology, it's clear that centuries of structural racism in the US are what has created the living conditions and the lack of opportunity that have been responsible for the racial differences in COVID in this country. A startling finding has been that the neighborhood assessments made as early as the 1930s by the US government-sponsored Homeowners Loan Corporation are directly related to current-day health disparities, including prevalence and severity of pre-vaccine era coronavirus. By rating different neighborhoods in different ways and making mortgage money and financial assets available differentially, this basically set the stage to create the difference that we saw in the recent pandemic. Now, not only can race have health effects like that, it can actually have genetic effects. It can affect our genes. A genetic aspect of aging is the loss of the material at the tips of our chromosomes called telomeres. That little bit of DNA gets lost every time our cells reproduce and our chromosomes are doubled for the reproduction. When too much of the DNA at the tips is lost, this cell no longer is able to line up, the chromosomes are no longer to line up, and the cell can no longer divide, and the cell line then dies off. This loss can actually be accelerated by sociocultural stress, and my friend Lance Gravely has recently helped demonstrate how African Americans are suffering this type of genetic loss as a result of racism directed at them. This is a direct genetic and health consequence of the social construction of race. So, finally, I'm going to shut up. Here's what I want to get to. There are biological races or subspecies in some species, even some very closely related to us, like chimpanzees. But human genetic variation doesn't fit into that kind of racial pattern. Race is a social construction in humans, and it's been used over the past several centuries to establish and maintain power hierarchies. As a result, explanations of differences between races in behavior or education or wealth or health must be sought in social and economic terms, not simply biological and genetic ones. And finally, although race is not a valid biological category in humans, it has real biological implications in terms of inequality of morbidity and mortality, and it even impacts our genes. Many of the threads I've laid out in the talk that I've given today are covered in more detail in our podcast series, Speaking of Race. in that we attempt to take an historical and scientific view of past and present ideas about race and their effects on our current population. We even have a 3-part series on race in India. I invite you to browse through our catalog of episodes and correspond with me, and I'd be more than happy to help with any of your teaching, learning, or research on race. And thank you. Yeah. That's all I've got for today. I'm sorry. That just goes on and on and on. I'm sorry.
Yes, yes. Actually, I'm speechless, and this thrill that uh, I have learned a lot from this your lecture, and it's quite interesting, wonderful lecture you have given. So I think all the participants who are joined today, they are very fortunate to listen the different context of race. You know that in our anthropology class, those who are here from anthropology background from India. So what the in our syllabus that we are first we study the UNESCO statement of race, and after that, Professor B.S. Guho, Professor S.S. Sarkar, and Professor H.H. Risley, they define the race of the Indian populations only. So that's the category, different category of races we are teaching in our day-to-day life and even after in university classes. But the thing is that all these three type of racial classifications given by these eminent anthropologists from India, these are based on the biological context, different anthropometric measures and different somatometric forms they are given. Yes, your thinking process is very important. The fact that the social constructions of races should not be ignored in terms of the human beings, that's because the genetic diversity is very low. And there are very important segments you pointed out that in the aging process in the last slides that the deletions are happening in the throughout the process. So after this particular lecture, I don't know how many you are excited, but it is our request to all of you, if you have any questions or any clarifications or any sort of comments on this particular lecture, you can unmute and directly talk with Professor Bindon.
And I'll try and make some sense out of what I said.
That's great. That's great.
Sir, thank you so much. Probably this is the best lecture I have heard on this particular issue. I have never heard this kind of lecture on race. So it is very interesting. Though I am from social cultural anthropology background, one question was coming to my mind because your last point, it struck me that we should more focus on social cultural background rather than, although you said that we cannot ignore the biological difference.
Whoops.
But at this point of time, when we are all over the world, we are thinking about coronavirus and this pandemic situation. I would like to know your idea whether this biological differences of human beings is really important in case of pandemic. I mean, being affected by the coronavirus. Is there any relationship?
Oh, there's absolutely genetic differences between individuals that will affect their susceptibility and the severity of COVID that they might get. The thing that the point to remember is that it's not going to be patterned along those racial lines that we tend to think of. In the US, for instance, when African Americans were suffering tremendously from COVID in the early days of the pandemic, some people actively tried to say it was because of their genetics, and what we were able to ultimately demonstrate was that a number of things were going on there, starting with just the historical systemic racism against people of color in the US that has created the health deficit that they operate at. The fact that socioeconomically they're deprived, so they end up in jobs where they had to be exposed to COVID more than people who were elite old guys like me, you know, who I could sit at home. I didn't have to go somewhere to work. I'm drawing my pension, and so I can just sit at home and I don't have to get exposed to the disease. But, you know, there was a whole host of social factors that needed to be explained. And even our Anthony Fauci came out and pointed out that, you know, what we're dealing with here is a social situation that's making for the difference. And a lot of that has been sucked up once the vaccine began to be widely distributed. So it's that there are definitely, and again, that sometimes when I say race is a social construction, it gets interpreted as there's no biological difference. We're all genetically the same. And that of course, we have to say, no, we're not. We're genetically different. Even identical twins have different epigenetics. So there's different things going on, you know, all across the globe. It's just that the genetic patterning doesn't fit the lines of race that we've been taught to believe in all our lives.
Yes.
Does that make sense to you?
Yes, definitely, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Anybody else from the audience?
Hello, sir.
Hello.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, so, yes, sir. I'm Veronica, and I'm also from social cultural anthropology. And firstly, sir, thank you so much for such a riveting lecture. I thoroughly enjoyed your lecture. And for me, I may be so naive in understanding that, but coming from you, that physical field of anthropology and your alignment towards race as a social construction, that brought a new light into my understanding about anthropology. So I think we need more of such exposure. We in the field of anthropology, I think we need such exposure to have reflection of our field, of our understanding, and especially at this time when, be it in our country or across the world, I think when we are fighting racism or caste issues, I think it's so important to, reflect on this. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. We might actually have a few podcasts, a few episodes in our podcast series that would be of interest to you too. Among other things,
Sure.
we did a review of Isabel Wilkerson's book Caste, where she tries to draw the tie between race in the U.S. and caste in India. And of course, we do have an anthropologist on our team that works in India and has a fairly good understanding, I think, of caste. So that one might be of interest. But we've talked about these biological, the lack of biological validity in a number of our episodes. And if there's ever anything I can say or do or provide you as a resource, I'm more than happy. Don't I share?
Yes, Dr. Achobi Devi.
Thank you so much, sir, for this valuable talk. Sir, actually, I'm a college teacher of physical anthropology, but from 1.5 years, I have been teaching this physical anthropology in graduation. But from this moment, I don't know how to teach students about race. I'm very confused, sir.
I'm sorry.
I'm very confused, like by morphological differences or somatometrical differences, we have been teaching that there are 3 races, and we have divided 3 races according to their morphological differences or somatometrical differences. From this moment, I don't know, I'm not convinced that I have been teaching. Then suggest me some books or some readings so that I can teach them rest.
Certainly. First thing, you're more than welcome. I have a copy, a PDF, essentially, of the script of this presentation. You're also welcome to these slides. I will send them to you if you email me.
Thank you so much. I'll be waiting, sir.
And there are a variety of resources that that back this up. Our last episode of our Speaking of Race podcast, we interviewed an evolutionary geneticist and a physical anthropologist who just put out a book with questions and answers about the biological basis of race. Again, I will. I've made a document available. Dr. Chakravarti, could you?
Yes,
post
yes,
that
yes. I will
PDF
provide it. I will
and
provide
he'll.
it to all of you. And
Thank
yes,
you so much.
at the beginning of our communication, Professor Bindon sent me this PDF, and I am happy to share you that file. So let me give some time. Anyway, thank you. Thank you, Achobi Devi. Now, is there any comments? Anybody? One of my students said racism in 1 minute.
Racism and science, how can it impact scientific decision making?
Yes, yes.
Well, just think about what might have happened I'm thinking about, because of my lack of familiarity with other global populations outside of Samoa and the US, but think of what might have happened had we had true white supremacist scientists in charge of taking care of the pandemic in the US. We might not have had vaccines made available to people of color in this country simply because they wouldn't think it was a valuable resource that should be taken care of. If you go back and think about the papers that Jensen put out in 1969, and the bell curve, and the books that continue to come out continually about differences in the races in terms of how well they do on standardized tests, IQ tests, and the like, you get the understanding that their policy, their decision making would push us in the direction of moving away from committing any resources to try to bring up disadvantaged groups. And so there's all kinds of very important impacts that kind of racism can have within science. And unfortunately, it's a minority position, but it's still an important position in my country. I don't know how it plays out in different places across the globe. Was that a satisfactory answer?
Issue?
Oops.
Are you satisfied?
Yes, sir.
Yes, yes. Thank you. So, is there anybody here to make some comment? I am downloading this paper, and yes, I am putting this paper from the chat box, trying to put this paper in the chat box, or if anybody is willing to take this material, kindly put your email ID to the chat box so that I can send this copy to them. So it is better to kindly put the, yes, thank you very much. Please put your, mention your Gmail, any account, and I will be very happy to share the slides. And the thing is that Professor Bindon is very cooperative, and you know that at the initial stage, Professor Bindon shares so much resource material to me also, and it will help me a lot to study myself. That's fantastic, no? Every time. So apart from this, your lecture, is it possible to share some of the events when you did your work in Samoa? Your experience?
Oh my goodness, boy! It's been so long since I thought about working in Samoa. I haven't been to Samoa since 1991. That's the last trip I took to Samoa. Goodness gracious, I was a young man then. I didn't have a beard.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
One of the reasons that I got started in nutritional anthropology was I was looking at what was at that point in time an epidemic of obesity in Samoa. And so we were examining activity levels and diet, and I did a little bit of very bad genetic work. I don't want to talk about that. But what most caught my attention was the transition we could see in food patterns from working in very traditional villages, outlying villages in Samoa, to moving into more urbanized areas, to working with the migrants that lived in Hawaii. And that there was just this tremendous range of different choices of foods and how things had changed over time. So that was my entree into nutritional anthropology, and fortunately then my introduction to you ultimately.
That's great. And another topic you have done very good on paper is that is geophagy, I think, the consumption of the dust materials. So that is very unique, in my concept too, because in our syllabus we are not concentrating nutritional anthropology so much. We are basically concentrating the nutritional anthropology, the use of anthropometry in sports.
Yes.
And yes, so but there are some things that throughout the text I gone through the different text of Margaret Mead also, and when she did a very extensive work in after Second World War in US in order to rehabilitate and compensate the population through the nutrition. So it's a very good contribution also made by the social and cultural part of the anthropology too.
Absolutely.
So that is the beauty of the nature of anthropology, how to intermingle between the biology and culture. And see, today's lecture, Professor Bindon also expressed, try to intermingle between biology and culture, and finally, give the social construction, try to establish the social construction in very passionate way. And this may be the new direction of the research in Indian context too, because in India, you know that there's a lot of diversity is there, and even in India, we get the different tribal populations and some different origin also. So the skin colors and tribal population. I don't know whether COVID-19 is impacted on the different caste population too. So initial time during the April 2020, I have given one talk in the platform American Anthropological Association, and somebody asked me that whether there's a caste population, caste hierarchies have some impact of the COVID-19 successfulity, and the vaccinations are also important for getting this proper treatment. So yes, there is a new light Professor Bindon highlighted today, and I hope all the participants, they are extremely they benefited by the talk, and that is the end stage of our program today. So before we end, this is my formal duty to extend my gratitude and thanks to Professor Bindon for agreeing to put this lecture, Race is Not Physical Biology. And that this lecture is so amazing. Then even if after retirement, in 2015, he taught the race, right? And this is the 2022, the quality of slides is also important. This for our students also. I know Dr. Ratnatayan also agreed with us. This is one of the learning process for our students also. How to interpret, how to present your slides, and by simultaneously how you interpret the consequences, all the text in the form of the lecture. First thing is very recognizing that Professor Bindon, although he was awarded the best teaching award, but for me, he is the greatest human beings, from his mind, from his mind. So that is very important. That is very important, because first you always I thought that first you have to establish your mark in this world as to human beings. That is not only your biological entity, but it's your cultural and social entity, your existence, your mind, and your passion towards the goal of the scientific welfare of the human beings through anthropological knowledge. So that is the beauty. In the day of World Anthropology, we are very, very fortunate again, Professor Bindon, and we are thankful to you, and we are thankful to all the audience. I should mention the name, the Professor H. Vendaro Singh. He is the professor of Rajiv Gandhi University, Arunachal. The Arunachal, Professor Bindon, is located in the northeastern part of our country. So yes, and majorities of these students and teachers, they join from the northeastern part of the countries. We basically love the people. They have enormous diversity, dedications, and the passion regarding the learning of anthropology is very, very way. And I also thankful to Dr. Tharaka Ananda. She is one of our collaborators from University of Sri Jayawardhanepura, Sri Lanka. She is also a budding anthropologist, and I hope that she will be establishing herself. So beside that, I saw that Dr. A.R. Sankhayan is there. He is the one of the eminent anthropologists and historians and paleoanthropologists in India, and he spent his life in Anthropological Survey of India. You know that in our country you have the Anthropological Survey of India for Ministry of Culture, and from the national level policy, and to understand the different kind of cultural and biological diversity of the population throughout the India. So thank you, sir, Professor Sankhayan, Dr. Bhaskar Das, and also Birpal Singh. Dr. Birpal Singh is there. So thank you very much to everyone. I excuse that I don't able to give all the names. But anyway, that is the end of our today's program. I think this is one of the historical program, and we should remember in our future time that Professor Bindon came, and we hope that Professor Bindon will come again and again in our platform. This is the very greatest opportunity for the COVID-19. We create the COVID-19 to the online platform, right?
Yeah.
So I repeatedly thought that if once I will visit in US, then obviously I will meet you. But this is the first stage of meeting, and I just roaming in my mind how I can connect you, and that is the best way we can connect. And thank you so much, and hope
thank you
for everyone who have participated.
Thank you.
And
Thank
for
you.
effort.
Thank you.
And making this
Thank you, sir.
successful.
Thank you so much, sir.
And we'll be organizing this kind of program time to time. So stay with us from bottom of your heart. So thank you very much, and have a wonderful night, and good night to all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.